Hey, what's up? Chess Dog back with another video here, and today it is a modern masterpiece. It's just been played as the shooting of this video. It's Caruana against Lagrave. An incredible opening, very sharp play, a novelty that involves sacrifices, and an amazing endgame. And I'm not going to pretend to understand all the nuances. It's going to take grandmasters and computers a long time to figure out all the details. Even as Magnus Carlsen was analyzing this game live, he needed the table bases to get a sense of what was going on in the ending. Yet Caruana was able to find a way. It was truly one of them, a very memorable performance. Let's get right into it. It begins with a Sicilian. Knight f3, d6, c4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then a6. That's Lagrave's signature. He loves to play the Najdorf. He's brilliant at it, but the other top grandmasters know that he plays it, so they prepare things, and that's what happens here. Bishop g5, the most aggressive line that white can play. e6, f4, queen to b6. Lagrave plays the poison pawn variation, the variation that's been played by Fischer and Kasparov, and is usually considered the best line. However, what ends up happening is white sacrifices material for the attack, and black has to defend. Lagrave is prepared to do that, but it leads to very sharp double-edged positions. Queen d2 gives up the b2 pawn, the classic poisoned b2 pawn. Rook b1, queen to a3, e5. This is all theory. He wants to attack that knight on f6 and then pry open the d file, maybe have some tactics on that file. h6, a good move. And after bishop h4, the idea is after taking on e5, black might be able to play g5, because a lot of times there are some tactics involving this bishop and maybe that d file and the potential mates. So it's a good idea for black to have the option of g5 a bit later. Taking knight f d7, knight e4, putting some pressure here on this d6 square, and also the c5 square of a bishop we're wanting to pop in there, or a knight. Queen takes a2, takes more material. Rook d1, piling up. You can see some of the pressure building on this d8 square. Queen d5, queen e3, protecting the knight on e4 and also unveiling the d1 rook against the queen on d5. Queen takes e5. If he takes with the knight on b5, the knight b3 is a pretty good move for white. Queen e5, c3. Now, a little footnote about this c3 move. In my database, it's only been played 6 times, and black has done pretty well. In fact, black has won 3 of the 6 games. White has won 1, and there have been 2 draws. So this is an area where it was thought that black was doing pretty good. Bishop c5, piling up on that pinned knight. So the knight at e4 is pinned by the queen, the knight at d4 pinned by the bishop. Bishop g3 counterattacking the queen. Queen to d5. Now, in all the games that have been played up to this point, in this position, bishop d6 is the move that was played. And the game, white followed bishop d6. Knight to b5 is an idea, and everything's sort of converging on this d6 square. These knights, this rook, all sort of converging on d6. Black, who's already up in material, plays queen d1, king d1, bishop e5. But he's got compensation, as you can see. He's got a minor piece and a rook, as well as a couple of pawns as compensation. Knight bd6, king e7, knight c4, rook to d8, king c2, bishop c7, bishop e2, and this is supposed to be a very, very strong position for white. White's doing very well in this position, but I'm not going to get into the details of it. To be honest, I don't know all the details of it, but white's doing well here. But instead of bishop d6, bishop c4. What? This is a novelty. I put it in my computer just to check. It gives black a slight edge here, very, very slight. But you have to figure out how to deal with this over the board. And Caruana has probably studied it and there's a good chance Lagrave has not. So this is really, really sharp stuff. And black does what you would think. He takes the bishop that's just been offered. Now bishop to d6, and you'll notice that if black plays bishop takes d6, then knight takes d6 is a fork of the king and the queen. So he's got to watch out for this sort of geometric relationship that exists between these pieces. And black can't castle in this position. That dark squared bishop is very powerful. So this is a way for white to actually preserve the dark square bishop in this position. Pretty amazing. He plays knight f6, an interesting variation showing some of the potential of white's position. If black plays a very natural move, bishop d4, move like rook d4, queen b3, queen g3, attacking this square and also this knight. Queen to b1 check, king f2. Now this, black's okay here, but not if he takes the rook on h1. After queen g7, this is actually a long forced mate. One particular line would follow thusly. Knight f8, knight to f6 check, king d8, bishop to b8 check, bishop to d7, queen takes h8, king e7, bishop d6, king d8, queen takes knight, bishop e8, queen takes e8 check. That's one of many mates. But after queen g7, the game is over. So bishop d4 is a natural move. Lagrave avoids it, plays the superior, knight to f6, knight c5, and now Caruana has an unopposed dark squared bishop. That's quite an achievement here. And this little constellation of pieces, these minor pieces, is quite intimidating and imposing. Knight d5, queen e5, threatening this. Rook g8, very good move. Not just defending the pawn, but if that pawn falls, then all of a sudden all of these dark squares become that much weaker. So he needs to preserve that g7 pawn. Knight de6. Boy, this is really something. fe6, knight e6. Now, Lagrave plays queen c3 check, forcing queens off the board. And this might be a point that if you're black, you would breathe a sigh of relief. Queen c3, knight c3. And he probably does have a reason to breathe a sigh of relief. He's not going to get mated in the way that he might have gotten mated in some of the other lines. But this endgame is still not easy. You'll notice we have some degree of material equality. Here he plays king to f7, king d7, rook d3, knight e4, bishop f4 check, king c6, simply castling. And if black tries to save the rook on a8 by playing rook to a7, then rook c1, knight c5. If king b6, it's just a mate. Knight c5, rook d6, king c7, boom, and all the pieces are just coming in. Double check, king d8, rook takes c8, wins the last rook, wins the other rook on g8, and that's that. So king f7, rook d3, knight e4, castles with check on move 27, unusual. King g6, knight a8. Now material is equal, but unbalanced. White is up in exchange, but in exchange for that, black has two pawns and an extra minor piece. So material is equal, but the activity of the rooks is so strong here, and the vulnerability of white's king really does give white an edge. Knight c6, knight to b6, getting it out of there. Rook d8, snapping off that bishop. Rook c8. Now, he plays bishop to a3. Another line was rook to e1, knight f6, rook to b1. This may have been a bit better, computer insight. After b5, rook c1, and he's threatening to double rooks on that c6 knight. So he plays knight e7, rook takes, knight takes. Bishop b4, he will be stopping the pawns from advancing by controlling that a5 square with the bishop. Knight b6, rook d6, attacking a knight, knight b d5, bishop e1, king to f5, and then the harvest on the queen's side begins. So rook to e1 might have been a bit better than bishop to a3, which was played in the game. Rook c7, controlling that 7th rank, so white can't get his rook on it. Rook to f4, advancing the rook with tempo. Knight f6, bishop to b2. And look at white's pieces are very well placed. Bishop on the long diagonal, rooks are quite active. Knight e7. Now he gives the bishop up to split black's pawns and to reduce some of black's potential counterplay and trickery with those knights. So now, instead of having 2 knights, there's 1 knight on the board, and it's a more simplified position for white to try to get a win. Gf6, h4, h5, rook g3, king to f7, rook g5. He can go there, of course, because the pawn on f6 is pinned by the rook on f4. Rook c1, king h2, knight g6, threatening the rook on f4. Comes back, knight h4, rook h5. But now the knight has to go back, and rook h7, king e6, rook takes b7. Knight e5, rook to b6, blocks that check with the rook, take. And now greater simplification has taken place. And this is where we get into the world of table bases and complexity. Again, it's beyond my understanding and the understanding of a lot of people. But we'll take a look at it because it's still very interesting. King g3, king f7, rook c2, knight b4, rook d2, knight c6, king f4. Now, you'll notice I have the f5 square highlighted. It turns out this f5 square is a very, very important square. If black wants to hold this position, any chance of holding this position, he's got to keep the white king out of f5. That's a very key square for him to prevent white entering on. If white can get there, he's in good shape. So king g6, preventing that. Rook d6, knight e5. So he says, I'm giving up this pawn on a6, and I'm going to try to create a fortress with the king, knight, and pawn. And it turns out that it's technically possible to create a fortress. We only know that because of Carlson telling us that after having looked at the databases, or table bases. But it's extremely hard to do. It's also hard to win this, and Caruana is able to do that. The knight goes to f7, and part of keeping white out of this f5 square, notice the knight on h6 does that. The knight on d6, well, obviously it wouldn't be on d6 right now because it would be taken, but a knight on d6 would keep you out, and also a knight on g7, the classic Fianchettoed knight. That would be a key square for black in attempting to hold this position. King to e4, knight h6, rook to a5. Very difficult. Technical draw still, I think, but hard to hold. Knight f7, rook a3, knight d6, king f4, knight f5, rook d3, knight h6, rook g3, king f7. So he wants to force black to relinquish control of the f5 square. A secondary idea would be to get black to relinquish control of the h5 square, and the king could perhaps make it to h5 and outflank black in that way. And that is, in fact, what ends up happening in the game. King e4, knight g8. Now he gets the f5 square. He hadn't had much choice. Knight e7, king f4, knight d5, king g4. He begins the maneuver. Now he's going to try to outflank him on h5. King g6 to prevent that. King f3, king f7, king e4. Knight. I think Caruana is trying to find a way through it right now while dealing with this clock. Knight d5, king f5. Table bases tell us that king f3 is the better move, but who can figure out why? King f5, knight e7 check, king e4, and again, table bases tell us king g4, okay. King e4, knight g8, rook h3, king g6, rook a3, I know, folks. King f7, king f4, knight h6, rook g3, knight g8, and this is where the winning maneuver is implemented. king g4, knight e7. I think the idea is if black plays king to g6, white could play king h4, and that would force him back to defend the rook, I mean the knight on g8, and then white would be able to go forward into the h5 square. Knight e7, king h5, and now the winning process. The game doesn't last much longer. Knight d5, rook f3, king to e6, g4, king e5, king to g6. And we knew this was a winning position because of the table bases. And they stopped playing, and they shook hands, and they began to talk. And the broadcast on the board said the game was a draw. And this was a real shock. Turns out that was not a correct broadcast, that this game was not a draw. And Lagrave had resigned. A possible idea is to block the rook's pressure on f6. They just bring the rook back, you know, or king goes here, and that's he's in check, so he has to do that. So, and at this point, it looks good. So, an amazing win. And if this is any indication to what we have to look forward to in the rest of the candidates, I am going to be a very, very excited chess fan. And please join us here at Chess Dog over the next few days to just enjoy some of the incredible chess we have to look forward to. See you soon.